Welcome to the show. You're listening to Green Hell, a Vietnam War podcast. Join me as I explore the history of the Vietnam War, remember the sacrifices and experiences of those who were there, and preserve those lessons learned and paid for through blood and unimaginable human suffering. Hey everybody, welcome back to the show. I'm your host, Stephen Comstock. As of this recording, it is Saturday, March 15th, 2025. Thank you so much for joining me on this continuing journey through history. All right, so there's a lot to get to in this episode. It's going to be a bit longer than the normal one, but I really want to wrap up my segue through the Russian Revolution and get back to Vietnam. So the next episode, I promise we're going to get back to Vietnam. Without further ado, let's get right into it. Okay, so in honor of Women's Appreciation Month, I'm going to kick off this episode recognizing a badass woman. Her name was Fanny Kaplan. And yes, I did mention Fanny Kaplan in the last episode. I'm pretty sure that I misgendered her to my great horror. And I need to go back and re-edit that episode. I haven't yet. This is my first attempt at rectifying my misspeak. Fanny Kaplan is a female, a real female. Fanny was born into a Jewish family. Her father was a teacher. She came from modest roots. As a teen, she became involved with revolutionary circles, got radicalized, and joined the Socialist Revolutionary Party. This organization was known for using political violence and assassinations to destabilize the Tsarist regime. In 1906, Kaplan was arrested for her role in a bombing attempt of Tsarist officials. Unfortunately for her and her comrade, the bomb prematurely detonated. It injured her, but it killed her comrade. She was captured, sentenced to death, but due to her age, the sentence was commuted to life imprisonment with hard labor. She spent a decade in a Siberian labor camp where the harsh conditions left her partially blind and with chronic health issues. Once the Tsar abdicated, she was released from prison in 1917. When she came back to Russia, she found that Lenin's suppression of rival socialist factions was unacceptable, not to mention all the other horrible shit that the Bolsheviks were doing. So her rage grew and grew. She came to view Lenin as a traitor of the revolution whose policies betrayed the very ideals of socialism and democracy which he claimed to stand for. On August 30th, 1918, Fanny attacked Lenin outside a factory in Moscow where he was addressing a crowd of workers. As Lenin walked to his car, Fanny emerged from the crowd and fired 3 shots at close range with a pistol. One bullet pierced his shoulder and lodged near his spine. The other punctured his lung. The third shot missed. Lenin collapsed and unfortunately survived, though his health was permanently compromised after this injury. Fanny Kaplan confessed immediately and reportedly said, quote, "I shot Lenin because I consider him a traitor to socialism and his continued existence undermines the revolution," end quote. If she was working with accomplices, she took their names with her to the grave. She claimed the whole time that she worked alone. She remained defiant under intense interrogation by the Cheka secret police and provided them with little more information. 4 days later, she was executed by a single gunshot to the head on orders from Bolshevik leadership. Her body was reportedly burned and disposed of in a barrel to erase any trace of her act of martyrdom. This would-be assassin had big proverbial balls, but was described as being small, frail, and soft-spoken, though she possessed an inversely proportionate spirit, determination, and hardness forged under 10 years of extreme hardship in the Gulag. But, alas, despite her bravery and resolve, her assassination attempt failed and ultimately fueled Lenin's rage. Also, it gave him political precedent to ramp up the repression and tyranny that marked his Red Terror. So that's the story of Ms. Fanny Kaplan, a real badass woman who took it upon herself to stop Vladimir Lenin by force, confessed and faced fully the consequences of her actions, refusing to plead or capitulate, enduring 4 days of interrogation, and finally facing execution by gunshot to the head without a proper trial. Now, on to Stalin. Born Joseph Vissarionovich, and I don't want to pronounce his last name because I can't, and I don't want to mess it up, so it doesn't matter. Joseph Vissarionovich Stalin, that's what he becomes, right? He's born on December 18th, 1878. As a child, Stalin contracted smallpox when he was 6. 3 neighbor boys living next door also contracted smallpox. They died, but he lived. He kept his life, gained smallpox scars, and the unique nickname Chapura, meaning poxy. Chapura and other boys in the village would play a game where they would run up to a speeding carriage and attempt to tag the axles by running alongside the carriage and reaching their arm underneath. During this game, his left arm was crushed. As a result, he got blood poisoning, but nevertheless survived this as well as smallpox. His left arm became withered and puny, but despite this, he continued to play this stupid game, and on another attempt, he had his legs crushed. After this, he won a new nickname, Geza, or Crimped. Geza was known as a scrappy lad who would fight anyone and everyone. He won some, but lost a lot. In spite of his scrappy upbringing, his mom pleaded and got him a scholarship for seminary. He dropped out of seminary 5 years in after having come in contact with the works of Karl Marx. He abandoned his faith, and instead he started organizing workers and spreading socialist propaganda. This resulted in him being captured and arrested 7 times. He was sentenced to Siberia 6 times, and he escaped from Siberia 5 times. He would escape by simply getting up and walking out of Siberia. Now, here's the thing. Most of the Siberian prison camps were so isolated that it was generally assumed that escape was impossible. And the only way you could escape was to walk through the Siberian forest and just keep going for hundreds of miles before you reached any kind of civilization. Most of the time, anybody who escaped, they died, but people did, and Stalin did 5 times. He took on an alias called Koba. Koba was based on a character. This character was a brave mountain man, a bold man of action, and an avenger of the main character in a novel about Russian oppression over the Georgians. Stalin himself was born in Georgia and identified very much with this moxie, and so he took on the name. He successfully adopted the persona that he started to gain a reputation for being kind of just a tough, hard, arrogant, selfish bastard. In the gulag, people would kind of complain about him because on one occasion, he watched a comrade drown in the river. He inherited all that comrade's books, but he refused to share them. Among other demerits against his character, Koba was also known to have impregnated a 13-year-old peasant girl, which won him no favor among his fellow political prisoners in the gulag. On his 6th exile, Koba went on a solo hunting expedition where he found himself all of a sudden in a flash white-out blizzard. He survived only by continuing to walk non-stop through the sub-zero temperatures until he made it back to camp. When he made it back to camp, his comrades' mouths dropped in shock at the fact that he was still alive, but really, he was almost half dead. His comrades nursed him back to health, and unfortunately, for tens of millions, this blizzard was not the end of Koba. And that effectively makes at least 3 encounters with death: smallpox, getting crushed by a chariot and having blood poisoning, and now surviving a blizzard. Now, it goes without saying, but Siberian blizzards are insane, okay? In Siberia, it's like -50, generally speaking, right? I'm not sure what time of year this was, but it was really cold. It was so cold that most normal people probably would have succumbed to hypothermia, but alas, he did not. After this, Koba published an article that same year, but he came up with a new name. His new name was Joseph Stalin, and Stalin translates to man of steel. During the Russian Revolution, Stalin was sent to the city Tsaritsyn with the task of holding that city against the White Army. He presided over the military there and ensured that Tsaritsyn was held from the year 1918 until 1920. It was during this time that Stalin would have a major confrontation with Leon Trotsky. April 10, 1925, Tsaritsyn was renamed Stalingrad in honor of Stalin's heroic effort to hold this city. But it was here at Tsaritsyn, later to be renamed Stalingrad, that the root of Stalin and Trotsky's beef was born. Now, let's talk about Trotsky for a second. Trotsky was the architect of the Red Army. He built the Red Army, he kept the Red Army going, and he was basically the supreme leader of the Red Army. And the thing that he's kind of known for is, one, recruiting 50,000 ex-Tsarist officers who, while politically outcast, were extremely necessary for the discipline and tactical survivability of the Red Army. And they were basically overseen by a dual leadership structure where loyal Bolshevik cadre oversaw the officers to make sure that the officers were maintaining the party line of Bolshevism, but the officers themselves were running the war. Now, this kind of dual command structure will play a significant role in the DRV's military structure, and we'll get into that in another episode, but just keep that in mind for now. This kind of using of ex-Tsarist officials in the military really pissed off Stalin. Stalin saw these ex-Tsarist officers as being class enemies and couldn't understand why they were being allowed to operate the army if they themselves were the bourgeoisie. Lenin, ever pragmatic, sided with Trotsky and ordered in front of Trotsky that Stalin follow Trotsky's example. Now, nobody likes being reprimanded, and especially in front of a rival, and especially being told that you have to listen to the rival. So Stalin disobeys Trotsky and had a bunch of ex-Tsarist officers who were in the Red Army at Tsaritsyn fighting against the White Army, loaded up on a barge, sailed into the middle of the Volga River, and a hail of machine gun fire sunk the barge, and all the officers drowned in the icy depths of the river. It was here that Stalin allegedly said, quote, "Death solves all problems. No man, no problem," end quote. Now, also at the siege of Tsaritsyn and fighting for the Red Army was a gifted officer named Mikhail Tukhachevsky. After holding Tsaritsyn, and because Lenin was feeling his oats, Lenin ordered Stalin and Tukhachevsky to invade Poland, believing it would be an easy victory that would further legitimize Lenin's socialist state And he also hoped and believed that immediately upon seizing Poland, the workers of Poland would rise up, and there too, a socialist revolution would occur. The invasion was stopped outside of Warsaw, and the Polish counterattack in the summer routed the Red Army and led to a complete disaster where an estimated 100,000 total casualties were taken. 66,000 of those were prisoners, 5,000 missing in action, and between 10 and 15,000 wounded, with another 10 to 15,000 killed in action. Now, that was a pretty horrible defeat, and that's a casualty rate of about 35% for the Red Army. Now, Stalin and Tukhachevsky pointed the finger at each other, but Stalin would never ever forget his newfound disdain for the Polish, and he would never ever forget his rivalry with Tukhachevsky. Okay, so by 1921, Russia was in ruins, with civil war ravaging the countryside, famine decimating the peasants, and the economy in complete ruins. As mentioned in the last episode, somewhere around 100,000 people are estimated to have been killed during Lenin's Red Terror. Now, the United States, once they became aware of the full extent of starvation sweeping over Russia, set up a relief agency called the American Relief Agency, funded to the tune of about 1.5 billion inflation-adjusted dollars. The sole purpose of this agency was to feed the starving Russian people. Now, not yet President Herbert Hoover was the American Relief Agency's chairman. Now, I'm gonna be honest. When I learned about this, I couldn't help but feel a deep sense of pride at the fact that the good old USA, full of all of our faults, and despite our corporate greed, or rather, because of our capitalist and corporate society, had accumulated enough wealth that we had more than enough to spread and help save the starving and tormented Russian people. The communists didn't turn down this aid either, it turns out. Lenin wasn't happy about it. He complained about it to his Bolshevik comrades, but what are you going to do, right? Your people are starving. Your stupid socialist revolution is hanging in the balance, and Lenin, ever the pragmatist, accepted American aid. One of the first Americans on the ground, a man named Harold Henry Fisher, wrote the following, describing what he witnessed of the starvation occurring under the Bolsheviks in 1921. Quote, "Imagine a compact mass of sordid rags, among which are visible here and there lean, naked arms, faces already sealed with the stamp of death. Above all, one is conscious of a poisonous odor. It is impossible to pass. The waiting room, the corridor, every foot thickly covered with people in every imaginable position. If one looks closely, one sees these filthy rags are swarming with vermin. Nursing babies have lost their voices and are no longer able to cry. Every day, more than 20 dead are carried away, but it is not possible to remove all of them. Sometimes corpses remain among the living for more than 5 days." End quote. Mr. Fisher's report, which I feel adequately captures the disturbing visage as one with empathy can only articulate, is contrasted by the following quote from Leon Trotsky, which I find to be rather indicative of the Bolshevik leadership's general attitude. Leon Trotsky says, quote, "We must put an end once and for all to the papist Quaker babble about the sanctity of human life." End quote. Now, around this time, some 2 million Russians were starving to death. The ARA relief workers documented cases of victims resorting to eating human flesh, the flesh of their deceased friends, family, and neighbors. And this was only after all other options had been exhausted, such as eating bark, grass, pets, and rats. Now, if you want to see some of the most disturbing images that there are, look up Soviet famine capitalism. Soviet famine cannibalism. And you're going to see a super disturbing array of pictures. But the most disturbing one I've ever seen is a picture of 3 Russian women huddled around a table full of body parts, captioned as evidence of their crimes. Most of the time, the cannibalism was the corpse-eating variety. In some rare cases, however, in remote villages, there are documented instances of some people killing the elderly, young, weak, or strangers and eating them for food. It was even documented that a starving mother killed one of her children to feed the others. And reports from a town called Samara mention cannibal markets where human flesh was traded. Now, I can't help but reiterating that this was almost too disturbing for me to believe. Even the pictures that I saw, they look so horrible, and it just looks fake, okay? It looks like a prop from a horror movie, but it's real. And I encourage you or challenge you to look it up, because this is real and it's important to remember that this happened. Lenin drove millions of people to such starvation that people were eating their loved ones and even killing their own children to feed their others. It happened. It's a fact. It's absolutely horrific. And guess what? It happens again under Stalin, but we'll get to that. Okay, so anyway, the Cheka, that's the Bolshevik secret police, documented over 300 cases of cannibalism in the Volga region alone. And those are just the documented cases. Of course, the Bolshevik press censored or downplayed the extent of horror and starvation occurring in 1921. In 2025, the real extent is placed at around 20 to 30 million people facing starvation, with around 5 to 6 million succumbing to starvation or starvation-related causes of death in the famine of 1921-1922. And like I said, I bring all this man-induced starvation and horror up in so pointed a manner to not only reiterate what an absolute shit show Lenin's revolution was, but to highlight the fact that all of this would occur again under Stalin and to a much greater extent. In fact, Lenin's Red Terror was only the prelude to Stalin's Great Purge. The Russian famine of 1921-1922 was the prelude to the Holodomor famine, which we'll get into in a minute. And Stalin's Gulag network was merely built on Lenin's labor camp network. And finally, just as Lenin would prosecute the kulaks, Stalin would do the exact same. So let's talk about the kulaks for a second, and then we'll get back to Stalin. So when the Bolsheviks first came to power, they instituted the seizure of land from the bourgeoisie and redistributed it back down to the peasants. As a result, some peasants thrived better than others, as is the nature of life. Now, Lenin always had a bizarre hate for the kulaks. He described them with terms like bloodsuckers and spiders, and said that they profited off the poor peasants. He even urged the execution of, quote, no fewer than 100 kulaks to crush a kulak resistance in 1918. You see, kulaks represented the top of the peasant pyramid. The lowest class of peasants were the bedniaks, who were landless or subsistence farmers and were seen as natural allies of the revolution. The middle-class peasants were the serendiaks, who had small landholdings and had just enough to survive but not prosper. The kulaks, the upper-class peasant, owned land, had surplus grain, livestock, equipment, and even hired laborers to help with the farming. However, it's important to note, kulak wealth varied by region, with some kulaks only being the owner of a single cow or horse. So when Lenin implements war communism to feed the Red Army and proletariat in the cities, the Bolsheviks seized grain from the peasants, starting with the kulaks. Many kulaks hid grain or slaughtered their livestock to avoid compliance. This caused Lenin's hatred for them to intensify. By 1921, tens of thousands of kulaks were arrested, executed, stripped of property, or sent to the labor camps. So-called committees of the poor, comprised of the bednyaks, were mobilized to identify and expropriate the kulaks. During the famine of 1921-22, kulaks were blamed as ringleaders when peasants refused to comply with grain requisitions, and as a result, entire villages of kulaks, thousands, were executed or deported. It is estimated that between 50,000 and 100,000 kulaks were killed or imprisoned under Lenin by 1921. Now, as I've said, and especially during the famine, prison often equaled death. And just to nail home how much Lenin hated the kulaks, his 1919 slogan was, quote, "All power to the Soviets, all land to the people, except the kulaks," end quote. And also, he famously said of the kulaks, quote, "Bloodsuckers, vampires, plunderers of the people and profiteers who fatten themselves during famines. Ruthless war on the kulaks," end quote. And he also said, quote, "Death to them, hatred and contempt for the parties which defend them. The workers must crush the revolts of the kulaks with an iron hand," end quote. So, yeah, Lenin really hates the kulaks. Anyway, after the Civil War, Lenin instituted a new economic policy. This new economic policy was known as the New Economic Policy, the NEP, or NEP. The goal of this policy was to stabilize the economy. As part of this new policy, Lenin tolerated the kulaks due to their utility as grain producers. The NEP also allowed for peasants to pay a grain tax on their harvest and then sell any remaining on the open market. Private trade was also permitted, reversing the ban instituted under war communism. Peasants, artisans, and small merchants could buy and sell goods, including agricultural produce, handicrafts, and consumer items in local markets or through co-ops. These people became known as NEP men. Now, the state retained ownership of major industries, i.e. steel, coal, railways, banking, and foreign trade, and a new gold-backed ruble replaced the old ruble in order to end hyperinflation and rebuild trust in the economy. Foreign firms were even offered concessions to operate in the USSR, leasing resources, i.e. oil and timber, or factories, in exchange for technology and capital. Examples include British and German firms coming to Russia to mine, and financial exchange occurred there. And finally, the NEP allowed workers and state enterprises to shift from militarized forced labor that was implemented under the war communism policies to a wage-based employment. Unions regained some bargaining power, though industries still remained under party control, and therefore unions still remained under party control. Now, if any of this sounds a little like capitalism and counter to what we know about Marxist theory, it's because it is. Lenin assured everyone that these measures were only a, quote, temporary retreat to take one step back to take two steps forward, end quote, for the sake of buying time for socialism. Many of the Bolsheviks, however, were opposed to this reversion back to a semi-capitalist form of socialism. Now, this is what's ironic, and the history of communism is just full of pitch black, tragic irony. Lenin's despised kulaks and the Nepomen prospered, increasing class inequality. But, turns out, to save communism, you must resort to capitalism, of course. Now, if you'll recall, the communists in Vietnam relied heavily on French capitalism to fund their revolution. This ends to a means, temporary reversion to capitalism becomes a theme in communist revolutions, as we'll see during the course of this podcast. But anyway, the economy recovered for about 7 years, and this brings us back to Stalin. So, by 1922, the Russian Soviet Federative Socialist Republic was renamed the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, the USSR, and the Bolshevik Party was renamed the Russian Communist Party. Stalin was appointed as General Secretary of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union by Lenin at the 11th Party Congress. Lenin's health was iffy, and he seemed to be delegating more authority to loyal lieutenants to handle the day-to-day operations. The Communist Party had ballooned from 24,000 members in 1917 to 500,000 members. And because Stalin had proven himself as a loyal party member with a knack for administration, he seemed the best fit for a job all about managing membership, appointments, and discipline within the ranks. And by discipline, I mean ideological and behavioral adherence to all things that make a good communist. So Lenin croaks in 1924, and the question arises of who would take the reins and steer the world's first communist ship into the future. Many saw the Red Army's grand architect and leader, Leon Trotsky, as the likely choice due to his military record and strong support from the armed services. Trotsky, however, was not as politically savvy as Stalin because he believed firmly in political loyalty rather than cultivating a network of personal alliances. He also was a huge proponent of carrying on the global communist revolution, permanent revolution. This mindset was in keeping with one of the core tenets of Leninism, which is that you must wage a global revolution because if you don't, then the world capitalists are going to crush the socialist state. By this time, however, after all the death and terrors of World War I, followed immediately by the horrible and bloody Russian Civil War and the famine and economic collapse caused by war communism, many party members advocated for a socialism in one country policy. Idea being to focus on Russia's internal socialist development and postpone any external agitation until the USSR had caught its breath. The primary political office that called all the shots in the government at this time was known as the Politburo. The Politburo consists of 7 members with voting rights and usually about 3 or a few more who could attend meetings but couldn't vote on policy decisions. The Politburo members at the time of Lenin's death were Joseph Stalin, Leon Trotsky, Lev Kamenev, Grigory Zinoviev, Alexei Rykov, and Mikhail Tomsky. Stalin proposed a triumvirate alliance with Kamenev and Zinoviev to politically outmaneuver Trotsky and outvote him on policy issues that they disagreed about. In addition to the permanent revolution versus socialism in one country policy, Trotsky disagreed with the growing bureaucracy being formed under Stalin, criticizing it as being stifling of the revolutionary spirit and alienating the working class. By 1925, Stalin, Kamenev, and Zinoviev turned forces against Trotsky and forced him out of his position as People's Commissar for Military and Naval Affairs. Between 1925 and 1926, Stalin continued to consolidate power and influence via his network of loyal appointees who'd he'd been cultivating from his role as general secretary. Now, ironically, or maybe not so, but in a turn of events that's going to prove pretty much the example of how this goes for the communists, Kamenev and Zinoviev formed an alliance with Trotsky and now turned against Stalin, formally challenging him at the 14th Party Conference. They criticized Stalin's support of the new economic policy, his growing dominance of the bureaucracy, and his handling of industrialization, which they saw as being mishandled and not appropriate for the time. By 1927, Stalin had successfully politically outmaneuvered these three. Trotsky was exiled to Kazakhstan and then later deported to Turkey. Kamenev and Zinoviev were marginalized politically and pretty much lost influence. In 1928, Stalin turned on the right-wing faction of the Politburo who supported the new economic policy, accusing them of coddling capitalists and the kulaks. By 1929, Stalin had placed enough loyalists in the Central Committee to ensure that Bukharin, Rykov, and Tomsky were removed from the Politburo. Propaganda painted them as traitors and marginalized them and their supporters. After this, Stalin launched his plan for rapid industrialization and forced collectivization of agriculture. The plan aimed to rapidly expand heavy industry, such as steel, coal, electricity, and machinery production, in order to modernize the Soviet economy and strengthen its military capacity. Specific targets were set for output increases, often ambitiously high. For example, steel production was to rise from 4 million tons to 10 million tons annually, and electricity generation was to triple. The goal of collectivization of agriculture was to fund industrialization and secure food supplies for the growing urban populations, the proletariat. And as you'll remember in communist thought, the proletariat are the key class of people in any kind of communist revolution. So the collectivization involved consolidating individual peasant farms into large, state-controlled collective farms. Grain requisitions were enforced to feed the industrial workers and generate export revenue. Implementation relied heavily on propaganda, coercion, and repression, the three staples of any communist society. Workers faced intense pressure to meet quotas, while peasants resisting collectivization were deported, imprisoned, or executed. Throughout the Soviet Union, millions were mobilized, including forced labor from the growing Gulag system. They were used to build factories, dams, railways. Now, just a quick note on the Gulag conditions. Class enemies and counter-revolutionaries in the Gulag were made to work hard labor, whereas the common criminal was not. The common criminals were the apex predators in prison because they weren't forced to work, and they would spend all their day drinking, gambling, taking bribes, and doing any other prison prize available to them, often at the expense of the class enemies. The class enemies and counter-revolutionaries would work in sub-zero temperatures. During the days, it could get as low as -50, and at nights, it could even get as cold as -100 in the darkest parts and darkest nights of winter. Clothing was minimal for class enemies, but common criminals, on the other hand, were afforded slightly better coats and shoes. Class enemies wore shoes that were merely tire tread wrapped with wire. And without going down another rabbit hole, just know that the gulags were absolutely the worst places on earth to be a living human. As bad as the Nazi concentration camps, and certainly responsible for as many deaths. Starvation and disease killed most. The unimaginable cold and exhaustion from hard labor killed many, many more. Prison violence claimed hordes, and just to really nail home the point, it was documented that at one prison, the guards would tie the hands and feet of a man and push him down a staircase of over 300 stairs. Now, as you can imagine, with the medical care that was afforded to prisoners, after taking a spill down 300 stairs, you were lucky if you died, because you do not want to be recovering with 1 million broken bones and almost no medical treatment. In fact, most of the medical treatment that prisoners were afforded was from other prisoners, i.e. the class enemies who were doctors and had some sort of knowledge of medical stuff, but they never had any access to medicine or equipment. In the summer, some prisoners would occasionally be stripped naked, tied to a tree, and devoured by mosquitoes. The sight was described as the person being covered with a thin black crust covering the entire body. This torture would last for several hours. The weaker men would die of blood loss, and those who survived would not be able to lay down for weeks without unbearable agony from the mosquito bites. Now, anyway, getting back on topic, by 1930, another man-induced famine was wreaking havoc across the land. As a result, some 2,200 village rebellions occurred, involving around 800,000 peasants. Stalin was determined to crush the peasant rebellions once and for all, just as Lenin had tried to do, but Stalin was a man of willpower, the man of steel. And the revamped secret police, formerly known as the Cheka, now renamed the NKVD, basically was injected with steroids and let loose on the peasants. They didn't just bring guns and fists, but artillery, poison gas, and aerial bombardments. Peasants resisted the tyrannical secret police by refusing to sow and reap more than the bare minimum that they needed to survive. When forced into state-run collective farms at gunpoint, the peasants, in defiance and retribution, slaughtered their livestock to the tune of 26 million head of cattle and some 15 million horses. They ate these animals, and for once in their lives, millions of peasants went to bed without sharp hunger pains. But like all things, it would not last, especially with the NKVD secret police spreading across the USSR to round up whole families and threatening people at gunpoint. These thugs were known to yell at small children, calling them kulak bastards and screaming that they were bloodsuckers. The peasants were moved to the state-run collective farms, loaded up on trucks, and entire villages were relocated. These people were often offloaded into a wide-open, empty field marked only with a stake bearing the state identification number for the farm. There was no shelter pre-built for them, there were no building materials for them, there was no fuel, and there was no food. Collective farms were forced to meet overly ambitious grain quotas, often leaving little or no food for the peasants themselves. Those caught hoarding any amount of grain or seed were executed on the spot by NKVD police. Movement was restricted so that peasants could not leave the famine zones. As a result of this, an estimated 10 million men, women, and children perished under these conditions. 10 million. And yes, reports of cannibalism occurred during this famine as well. This famine is known as the Holodomor, meaning death by starvation, and it goes down as one of the deadliest famines in human history, only to be outmatched by the Great Chinese Famine caused by eerily similar communist policies under Mao's CCP. The Great Chinese Famine killed an estimated 30 to 55 million people. One key difference that, as of today, is recognized by 35 countries is that the Holodomor was a genocide engineered by Stalin with the dual purpose of crushing the peasant resistance to collectivization, as well as crushing the Ukrainian people's national identity and spirit. As a result of Stalin's move towards collective farm and rapid industrialization, an estimated 30 million peasants moved to the cities, where some of them were converted to proletarian workers. For thousands more of starving peasants too weak to work, many of them died of starvation in the cities. Those who had not begun to bloat were sent to a holding area to starve on straw beds. Once they began to bloat, they were moved 40 miles outside of town and abandoned to die. The cost of all this man-made starvation and horror caused the Soviet Union to make significant strides in industrial capacity. New industrial centers emerged, and the Soviet Union laid the groundwork for becoming a major industrial power by the 1940s. The key point here is that the conversion of peasants to proletarians was a key aim of Stalin's policy because, as you'll recall, Marxist theory hinges on the fact that a proletarian class is the only class that can bring about the workers' utopia. The peasants are too illiterate and uneducated, and the bourgeoisie are the arch enemy of the people. So, while Lenin and Stalin both showed some tolerance to the peasants early on, both Lenin and Stalin brutalized them, exploited them as slave labor that, you would hope and you thought that socialists were vehemently against, but in the end, forced millions of peasants to die the slow, agonizing death of starvation, a prospect that was so horrible that it drove some to cannibalism. Now, on December 1st, 1934, a prominent Bolshevik leader was assassinated. Some question if Stalin had something to do with this. After all, he would have the most to gain by ramping up paranoia over internal enemies and counter-revolutionary plots. And in 1936, Stalin and the NKVD fabricated evidence alleging that a, quote, Trotskyist Zinovieite terrorist center involving, you guessed it, Trotsky, Zinoviev, and Kamenev had emerged in the Soviet Union with the aim of overthrowing the government and assassinating Stalin, all with the help of Nazi Germany. From August 19th, 1936 to August 24th, an event known as the First Moscow Show Trial was held. It marked the official launch of the Great Purge under the pretext of the Trotsky, Zinoviev, Kamenev terrorist plot. Zinoviev, Kamenev, and 14 others were accused of organizing a terrorist center under Trotsky's direction from exile. The NKVD extracted confessions through torture and coercion. Sound familiar? Zinoviev pleaded, quote, "One desire burns in my soul, to prove to you that I am no longer an enemy. There is no demand which I would not meet. I am yours, body and soul. I am ready to do everything to earn forgiveness and mercy," end quote. Kamenev, on the other hand, said, quote, "The practical management of organizing this terrorist act was carried out not by me, but by Zinoviev," end quote. At the end of the trial, as you very well may imagine, all defendants were convicted and Zinoviev and Kamenev were executed on August 25th, 1936. Trotsky, in absentia, was sentenced to death. 4 years later, he was killed at his compound in Mexico City when an assassin stabbed him in the head with an ice pick. Now, just let the sweet irony sink in for a minute. Trotsky, builder and leader of the Red Army, and Lenin's right-hand man, was killed by an assassin of the very nation he fought for, murdered for, and helped build. Now, honestly, the whole history of the Soviet Union and all the communists involved with that, it's really the best case I've ever seen for the existence of karma. Or maybe it's divine retribution. I'll let you be the judge. But anyway, the leader of the NKVD secret police at this time was a man named Yezhov. To give you an idea of this guy's character, I'll read a quote that he made to a group of Bolsheviks ahead of the Great Purge. He said, quote, "We are launching a major attack on the enemy. Let there be no resentment if we bump someone with an elbow. Better that 10 innocent people should suffer than one spy get away. When you chop wood, chips fly," end quote. 2 more show trials were held in Moscow. The second saw 13 defendants executed, 2 sent to the Gulag, and later killed by NKVD agents while in prison. 4 were spared. The third show trial resulted in 18 defendants being executed, including ex-NKVD head Genrikh Yagoda and Nikolai Bukharin, the main proponent of the new economic policy. 3 were sent to the Gulag and died shortly thereafter, shockingly. And the show trials were the visible tip of the Great Purge iceberg. While they targeted high-profile figures, about 50 executed across the 3 trials, the NKVD arrested and executed hundreds of thousands more under a secret police order titled Order Number 00447. This order targeted peasants who resisted collectivization, anyone with a prison record, and any other anti-Soviet elements, i.e. clergy, ex-White Army members, political dissidents, sectarians, anyone previously investigated by the NKVD, or just anyone accused. There were 2 categories of punishment: immediate execution by bullet to the head, or a Gulag sentence of 8 to 10 years. Now, here's the thing that blows my mind about this. Order 00447 set quotas for each category. As you very well may imagine, these quotas incentivized the NKVD to look for crimes where there were none, using the usual methods of torture to extract confessions and gain names of new targets. Also, because the NKVD agents were themselves terrified of being killed or sent to the Gulag under false pretenses, they would round up more enemies than the quota called for, giving themselves a nice cushion of human lives to insulate their own. Operations began in August 1937, and by November 1938, official records show at least 386,000 executions and over 400,000 sent to the Gulag, totaling around 800,000 victims, triple the initial plan. Victims were rounded up in mass arrests, often at night, and executions occurred at secret sites where bodies were dumped in mass graves. The Great Terror disproportionately hit rural areas and former opposition strongholds. Surprise, surprise. The influx of Category 2 prisoners swelled the Gulag system and fueled Stalin's industrialization with slave labor. Stalin halted the mass operation in late 1938 as the Purge's excess threatened economic stability and military readiness. Yezhov was scapegoated and he was forced to resign. His replacement, Lavrentiy Beria, arrested him, and the indictment claimed that Yezhov led a, quote, counter-revolutionary conspiracy with the NKVD to sabotage Soviet security and spy for foreign enemies. Bizarrely, he was also accused of homosexuality, then illegal, and personal degeneracy, allegations likely only meant to humiliate him. Again, let the karmic irony seep in for one glorious second. He was likely tortured before his execution, which occurred February 4th, 1940. Anecdotes describe Yezhov as being hysterical and sobbing at the time of his execution. His body was cremated, and the ashes were dumped in a common grave at Donskoy Cemetery, a fate shared by many of his own Purge victims. No marker commemorates him. Yezhov was airbrushed from official photos and excised from Soviet history. His wife committed suicide in 1938, and his adopted daughter was sent to an orphanage. Now, it bears noting that Stalin also purged the Red Army. This was known as the case of the Trotskyist anti-Soviet military operation. His former comrade from the invasion of Poland, Mikhail Tukhachevsky, was fired from his role as Deputy Commissioner of the Defense Ministry. He was tortured for days and forced to sign a confession where he claimed to have been recruited by the Germans and that he was engaged in a coup attempt. 5 other generals also signed similar confessions. 7,211 were shot. This purge absolutely gutted the military command structure. 3 of the 5 marshals of the Soviet Union were executed. 84 of the 90 generals were killed. 144 of 188 division commanders were shot. A few years later, the USSR fought and got their asses kicked by Finland. This poor performance was one of the reasons that Hitler felt emboldened enough to invade Russia. Now, this brings us to World War II. In August 1939, the USSR signed a 10-year non-aggression pact with Nazi Germany, ensuring that neither side would attack the other or support a third party against them. Secretly, this agreement included a division of Eastern Europe into spheres of influence. Germany would control Western Poland and Lithuania. The USSR would control Eastern Poland, Latvia, Estonia, Finland, and part of Romania. In September 1939, Germany invaded Poland from the east and Russia invaded from the west. Germany took about 48% of the country and Russia took the rest. The Red Army executed a staggering 22,000 Polish prisoners of war, gunning them down en masse and plowing over the mass graves. In total, Poland lost 70,000 military members that were killed in action, 150,000 wounded in action, and excessive civilian deaths, though the exact number is hotly disputed. The NKVD secret police deported 1 to 1.5 million Poles to Siberia and Central Asia and suppressed their culture. Now, remember that failed invasion of Poland by Stalin? Well, here is his revenge. But more pragmatically, Stalin aimed to buy time to rebuild the Red Army, which was weakened by his Great Purge, as well as he had the goal of reclaiming territories that were lost after World War I, and to create a buffer zone against future German aggression. For Hitler's part, his strategy was to avoid a two-front war, which, by conquering Poland, would allow him to turn west and fight France and Britain with the majority of his military. Now, not so surprisingly, the USSR denied this agreement with the Nazis until the 1980s, but released archival evidence that came out after the collapse of the Soviet Union proves that it was true. Germany eventually reneged on their agreement with the USSR, sensing the Red Army's weakness, and invaded Russia during Operation Barbarossa. Operation Barbarossa steamrolled over the Red Army so efficiently that if it hadn't been for the sheer size of Russia, they would have likely knocked out Russia early on. But like the Russians had done when Napoleon invaded in 1812, the Russians engaged in a scorched earth strategy where they fell back, destroyed anything and everything the Germans might be able to use to their advantage, and eventually this caused the Germans to overextend their supply lines, and they could not supply their forward progression. This occurred just in time for the Russian winter to come, and it ultimately halted the Germans in their place. Now, the Russian history of World War II is too long for this episode, but I will mention that notably at the Battle of Stalingrad, some 1 million Russians were killed, and by the war's end, it cost the Soviet Union 12 million people. World War II is known as the Great Patriotic War to the Russian people. Okay, so take a moment to contemplate the concept of the superego, okay? The superego is the collective ego of a population of people, okay? It's marked by things like culture, law. It's like a general mindset. It's also kind of similar to the zeitgeist, okay? And just think about this for a second. World War I, millions die, gunned down on killing fields. Russia gets its ass kicked. The Russian army is so fed up with it that they basically desert. They come home to Russia and immediately engage in a civil war, which is super bloody and violent and also results in 1 million shitty deaths. This kicks off a starvation, a famine, which leads to about 5 to 7 million people dying from starvation. Then, a few years later, Stalin comes to power, and another famine kicks off, which kills 10 million people. Follow this up by a purge, which kills between 800,000 and 1 million people. And then follow that up by World War II, okay? World War effing II, which kills 12 million Russians. Now, I'm not a psychologist. I'm not a sociologist. But something that traumatic has got to seriously screw up the psychology of a normal person, right? But now apply that to the collective body of people that comprise a nation, okay? Now, here's the thing. We're not even done yet. We haven't even gotten to the collapse of the Soviet Union. We just got through World War II, okay? Now, all of that is terror and bloodshed, but what about paranoia, okay? The rule of Stalin during this entire period, not to mention the effect that war communism under Stalin had on the Russian people, created such insane paranoia that it was described as being surreal, okay? In fact, one person said, you might denounce someone for fear of their denouncing you. You could be denounced for not doing enough denouncing. To do a man in, all you had to do was denounce him. You didn't even have to sign it. If you had a beef with anybody for anything, you could denounce them and they were off to the gulag or executed. If you coveted somebody's wife and you wanted to do them in, same thing. It was just absolute pure terror. There's no way around it, and there's nothing you could do except stay home and do nothing. And even then, someone might get suspicious of that, so you couldn't even be sure that that would save you. There was literally a total fear and paranoia that just settled in on the Russian people like a thick fog. And, you know, you can see why the Russians drink so much, all right? And that's not even being funny. That's being real. Like, the super ego of the Russians was so screwed up from all of this that I have described that it's no wonder that people were pushed to drinking so heavily. We all know someone who is an annoying, vindictive Karen who interjects themselves in your personal business and or will go out of their way to get you in trouble or let you have it in some other way, right? Karens became super popular buzzword during COVID for people that nobody liked, who was either complaining about masks or complaining about not having masks. Either way, just take that example, okay? COVID. You've got a Karen. They don't like you. You didn't wear a mask. Or you did wear a mask. Either way. And they call somebody and they say, hey, this guy is being fishy. He's not wearing a mask. He might be a spy. And next thing you know, he's rounded up and executed, okay? That's literally the scenario that's occurring in the Soviet Union during the Great Purge. This is like the Salem witch trial on steroids times 100. Okay, that's the closest analogy that people in the United States have to something like this, is the Salem witch trial, which burned, you know, what, like a few hundred ladies, maybe a couple thousand. I don't know how many it was, but it wasn't 800,000 people round up, executed or sent to the gulag by secret police, all because somebody denounced them or confessed under duress. But I digress. It is worth noting, however, that one lady was such a Karen during this time that the Communist Party exiled her from the party because she had denounced so many people. Her name was Comrade Nikolenko. This Russian comrade Karen was so dismayed at the fact that she had been expelled for doing her patriotic duty of denouncing the traitors that she wrote personally to Stalin himself, who had her reinstated with honors. This one lady, Comrade Karen, is believed to have been responsible for 8,000 deaths. This is insanity. This is insanity. This is like having lived through COVID times and post-COVID times, and, you know, being in my 30s, okay, I have a little bit of context to compare the world to. Nothing compares to this, where Comrade Karen is allowed to denunciate 8,000 people who are either executed or sent to the gulag, where they die probably, all because there's what is there? There's no rational explanation for it, okay? It doesn't exist. It's not a thing. And yet, that's the atmosphere that Stalin created and promoted over the Soviet Union during the mid to late 1930s. Also, another story that exemplifies the just absolute insanity of this great terror period under Stalin. So Stalin was giving a speech somewhere, I forget where, but when he concluded his speech, the crowd rises to its feet and starts applauding. Well, nobody wanted to be the first to stop applauding. And because nobody wanted to stop applauding, the applause kept going and kept increasing in intensity and didn't stop for 9 or 10 minutes. There were reportedly people who fainted because they were standing and applauding so hard for so long. And supposedly the next day, the very first people that went down were accused of being counter-revolutionaries and sent to the gulag for 8 to 10 years. This whole thing was a kind of feedback loop where, because of the quotas and the paranoia of the Great Purge, the local police were trying to show their zeal for the Communist Party and their zeal for capturing enemies and meeting quotas. So when a quota was met, they would request that they, expand the quota number, because, hey, if we show that we have zeal, we're safe. Yezhov is reported to have said, better too far than not enough. If an extra 1,000 people are killed by this operation, then it's not a big deal. Now, not to belabor the point here, but I'm just going to note that there were 53 major gulag systems and 473 labor camps across the Soviet Union. So all of this repression begs the question, how well aware was the United States and the rest of Western Europe to the full extent of the Great Terror? And the truth is that it's a complex mix of partial knowledge, deliberate misinformation, skepticism, and political bias. So the show trials were very well known. They were published throughout the world in Western newspapers such as the New York Times, the London Times, the French publication Le Monde, but it was not clear to the people of the West the full extent of the Great Purge on the rest of the public. Western embassies in Moscow, including those of the US, Britain, and France, were picking up on rumors and anecdotal evidence of mass arrests, disappearances, and gulag deportations beyond the show trials. And even diplomats noted the sudden absence of Soviet officials that they'd worked with, but the full extent was unknown due to the fact that the Soviet Union had clamped down so hard on journalists in the Soviet Union. The best reports to the West came from defectors who managed to escape and gave their firsthand testimony to Western intelligence and press. Other courageous Western journalists reported on the facts, but they lacked the hard data to back up the statements or, premises of their articles. And of course, like with anything, you had people that would downplay the Soviet atrocities and skew it or spin it to be not as bad as it really was. New York Times correspondent Walter Duranty goes down in history as being notorious for downplaying Soviet atrocities, including the Great Terror. Though he was a Pulitzer Prize-winning reporter from the early 1930s, he minimized the Holodomor, and he framed the purges as internal housekeeping rather than mass repression. But it wasn't just him. There were politicians in Western governments who viewed the Soviet government as a counterweight to Germany and therefore an alliance of convenience in the event that shit hit the fan with Nazi Germany, as it would. And as it did, the Soviet Union became an ally of the United States. In addition to the pragmatic reasons why politicians and some journalists would minimize the Great Terror occurring in Russia, there was also kind of an ideological factor here. There was a sympathy for socialism among some Western intellectuals, especially in France, that clouded their judgment and spun a certain level of bias into their worldview that they just couldn't believe the numbers that they were hearing, the claims they were hearing, and they called it, of course, conservative exaggerations and conspiracy theory, although that wasn't a term widely used back then, but you get the gist. It was like, oh, that can't be true. That's too wild to be true. Well, it was true, okay? It was true. The bottom line is that Western intelligence services were hearing about it, but they couldn't confirm anything. And in the press and in public perception, the show trials were widely well known, but the full extent of the Great Terror, of the Great Purge, was up for debate as there was no hard evidence to back any of it up, and leftists claimed that it was conservative hysteria, exaggerating the figures, and conservatives were like, no, this is true, Stalin's that bad. Things started to change for the West in their view of Stalin and the Soviet Union post-World War II. With World War II concluded, the Nazis defeated, almost immediately there was a shift from our comrades, the Soviets, to our potential enemy, the Soviets. We had a few things on our side that the Soviets did not, chiefly among them being the atomic bomb. The Soviets, for their part, were secretly working furiously to develop their own, which they gained in 1950. But in the meantime, we began waging a kind of proxy war against communism writ large, and that manifested itself with the United States support for the French against Ho Chi Minh's DRV, and with the rise of the Chinese Communist Party in 1950. All of this is going to play a major role in Vietnam's victory over the French, because as the CCP gains its legitimacy as a communist country, it starts funneling aid to Vietnam. Stalin himself begrudgingly starts to support the Vietnamese, and 1950 kind of marks, in my mind, the beginning of the Cold War, the real Cold War. Because in 1950, the Korean War kicks off, the United States goes to Korea, and the French begin fighting an even bitterer battle against the Vietnamese. The Vietnamese, now emboldened and aided by Chinese communist support, ramp things up to the next level. But back to Stalin for a second. So what happens post-World War II? Well, Stalin tightens down control over the Soviet Union, fearing internal dissent and external threats. He's a man racked with paranoia. The Great Purge is gone and over with, but its echoes linger deeply in the people of Russia. Nobody is safe and everybody is still paranoid. And in January 1953, Stalin accuses a group of predominantly Jewish doctors of plotting to assassinate Soviet leaders, including himself, on behalf of Western intelligence services. This fabricated conspiracy theory, announced in the Pravda, which was the Soviet official propaganda publication and only publication, signaled a new purge targeting the party elite, military, and ethnic minorities. Arrests began, and anti-Semitic propaganda surged, heightening tensions. This lasted until March 1st, 1953, when Stalin suffered a stroke at his dacha near Moscow after a night of heavy drinking with inner circle party members. Those members were Beria, head of the NKVD, Khrushchev, Malenkov, and Bulganin. Guards found Stalin unconscious, but they delayed medical help out of fear that Stalin would seek retribution against them because, one, he had forbidden disturbances, and two, to know Stalin's true health condition, especially something that debilitating, almost immediately meant death or exile, because to know something like that is a vulnerability that Stalin certainly would not put up with. He lingered for days and finally died March 5th at the age of 73. The Kremlin announced that a natural death from a cerebral hemorrhage had occurred, but rumors swirled to the contrary. Some historians suggest poisoning, possibly by Beria, the NKVD chief, who feared that Stalin's next purge would target him. And to be fair, if the history and trends are any indication, Beria was certainly not safe. Nobody was. And that is the atmosphere of paranoia that Stalin created. An atmosphere of paranoia that potentially led directly to his death, because if somebody, a stroke specialist, had been able to get to him in time, he possibly could have been rehabilitated. But because he had killed all the doctors and because everybody feared him, nobody was willing to act quickly on his behalf. Stalin's lieutenants were terrified during his final days, unsure whether his death was a trap or a genuine end. If he recovered, he would likely have all of them shot, and if he didn't, then they could finally be free, but alas, a new power vacuum would have to be filled. Stalin's death was mourned publicly. Millions attended his funeral, but privately, many in leadership, and I'm sure millions of citizens were relieved that this heinous, horrendous dictator was finally off the scene. Initially, there was no single successor to emerge, and a triumvirate of Politburo members formed by Malenkov, Beria, and Molotov shared power, and Nikita Khrushchev became the party secretary. Kind of following Stalin's footsteps, he gained influence and party power behind the scenes by developing networks and consolidating power through appointments. Beria moved to consolidate power, proposing liberal reforms, including the release of Gulag prisoners, to win support. His rivals, fearing his NKVD control, had him arrested June 26, 1953, in a coup led by Khrushchev and Marshal Zhukov. Accused of treason and espionage, Beria was executed on December 23, 1953. By 1955, Khrushchev had sidelined Malenkov and emerged as first secretary. Then, in 1958, he became the premier. On February 25, 1956, at the 20th Congress of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, held in Moscow, Nikita Khrushchev gave a speech that is known in history as the Secret Speech, formally titled On the Cult of Personality and Its Consequences. This 4-hour speech was a bombshell, marking the beginning of de-Stalinization by publicly denouncing Joseph Stalin's crimes, his cult of personality, and the excesses of his regime. While not intended for wide dissemination, it quickly leaked, sending shockwaves through the Soviet Union, the Eastern Bloc countries, and the global communist movement. In the speech, Khrushchev attacked Stalin's self-aggrandizement, calling it a betrayal of Marxist-Leninist principles. Khrushchev said, quote, "It is impermissible and foreign to the spirit of Marxism-Leninism to elevate one person, to transform him into a superman possessing supernatural characteristics akin to those of a god," end quote. Furthermore, Khrushchev detailed the full extent and details around the falsified Moscow show trials, which named victims like Zinoviev and Kamenev and Bukharin on trumped-up charges, and he exposed all of this, revealing the full scale of the Purge. Khrushchev pointed to Stalin's paranoia rather than any real external threat for the reason why this purge occurred. He said, quote, "Stalin originated the concept enemy of the people. This term made possible the usage of the most cruel repression, violating all norms of revolutionary legality," end quote. Khrushchev detailed the 1937 purge of the Red Army and criticized Stalin's handling of World War I, blaming him for ignoring warnings about Hitler's 1941 Operation Barbarossa, which led to early defeats. He also criticized Stalin's micromanagement and refusal to retreat, which cost millions of lives unnecessarily, he argued, saying, quote, "Stalin put his own interests above everything and everybody, subordinating the interests of the party and the people," end quote. Khrushchev denounced Stalin for his deportations of entire ethnic groups, and he framed Stalin's actions as being, in general, a deviation from Lenin's egalitarian vision urging a return to collective leadership and socialist legality. Despite all this, Khrushchev notably did not mention his own complicity as a loyal Stalinist and someone who participated in purging dissidents and peasants in Ukraine during the 1930s. And he downplayed the Holodomor and instead focused rather on Stalin's personal failings. Of course, classic communist behavior. Blame the other and paint them as the reason for the problem rather than actually examining the real issue. This speech was a shock to the audience. It destroyed their perception of Stalin's infallible image, and it's reported that some even fainted and had heart attacks at what they were hearing. As a result, millions were released from the Gulag, as many as 8 million by 1957. Political prisoners were rehabilitated, and censorship was eased slightly, of course. Naturally, the Stalinists in attendance were very upset with Khrushchev's denunciation of Stalin, and they nearly ousted him in 1957, but alas, they didn't have the military support that they required. This denunciation of Stalin and Stalinism reverberated through the world, leading to the Hungarian Revolution, which sought an exit from the Warsaw Pact, inspired by the de-Stalinization that was occurring in the Soviet Union. Khrushchev, unfortunately for the Hungarians, crushed this rebellion with tanks, killing thousands and showing that he was not as liberal as people had hoped. Communist parties in France, Italy, and the United States faced a crisis, with some defending Stalin and others splintering off. The speech bolstered anti-Soviet sentiment among Western leftists, and in China, Mao Zedong, a stark Stalin admirer, rejected Khrushchev's critique and widened the Russia-China split. Stalingrad was renamed to Volgograd in 1961. Statues of Stalin were toppled, and his body was removed from Lenin's mausoleum in 1961. Khrushchev dismantled the extremes of Stalin's authoritarian system, but one-party rule and the KGB remained. Under Khrushchev's leadership, the USSR engaged the United States in economic and military competition, which led to the space race as well as the arms race. After Khrushchev and until the Soviet Union's collapse in 1991, tensions with the West ebbed and flowed, and ultimately the Soviet Union crumpled under the weight of the arms and space race against the United States. Their economy simply couldn't compete with the US's capitalist system. Okay, so I'm going to bring this episode to a close now, and I'm going to bring up a couple final thoughts and a shout out. Okay, shout out first. I'm going to shout out to Bill Whittle and his documentary series, Season 3 of What We Saw, titled An Empire of Terror. In that series, he gives a detailed look at the Russian Revolution from Lenin all the way through Stalin. And in Season 2 of his series, What We Saw, he goes deeply into the Cold War. And I highly, highly recommend that if you have any interest at all in the Cold War or the Russian situation under Lenin and Stalin, that you look into those series. I know that the Cold War series is on Spotify, but An Empire of Terror is not. I'm not sure where you can find that. It might be on YouTube. Okay, concluding thoughts. Considering all of the horrors that I have outlined that have occurred to the Russians under Lenin, under Stalin, the man-induced famines, the prosecution and repression of class enemies, the executions, the shows of force, the purposeful use of terror to bring people in compliance, the use of a vast gulag system that claimed millions of lives from hard labor in extreme cold with hardly any food, prison camps where people were tortured by being stripped naked, tied to trees, and devoured by mosquitoes. I mean, it boggles the mind, the things that I have described, and I haven't even given you all the details because of time, okay? I can assure you, the prison camps under the Soviet Union were as bad as the prison camps under Nazi Germany. The main difference? Well, the Nazis were fascists and the Soviets are communists. The Nazis distinguished enemies based on ethnic or race lines, whereas the communists distinguished enemies based off of class or political distinctions, okay? But in the end, the death toll under the Nazis and the death toll under the Soviets are very comparable, and they used similar methods. They used labor camps. They used death squads. They used secret police. They used propaganda. They used political narratives, okay? So given all of this, why do you think it is that the Communist Party in the United States is not viewed with the same repulsion as the Nazi Party is? It is estimated that around 40 to 50 million people perished as a direct result of Nazi Germany's actions, whereas an estimated 100 million people have died under communist tutelage under the Soviets, under the Chinese, under the Khmer Rouge in Cambodia, and all of the others. Personally, I think a large part of why we remember the Nazis as the ultimate exemplification of evil and not the Soviets is because the Soviets were our ally during World War II, and because pictures like Stalin seated with Churchill and Roosevelt at Yalta are hardwired in the American superego. For Americans, the greatest embodiment of evil is the fascism of Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan. But I say to you that evil is evil, whether it's the communists persecuting class enemies or the Nazis persecuting ethnic and racial minorities. The fact is that any ideology that results in millions of deaths due to a hatred of some other is evil. And with that, I'm wrapping it up for this episode. Thanks for sticking in there with me. I hope you learned a lot. Next episode, we're getting back to Vietnam. Count your blessings. Be free, be brave, be bold. Talk to you next time.